and thank you for the very, very warm introduction. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I think I have, for better or for worse, I have been involved in the AfCFTA negotiations from the very beginning. I have been involved in the negotiations about the negotiations of the AfCFTA. And the reason I mention this is because in 2012, in the year 2012 in Ghana, in Accra, we agreed at that time on a plan that we call Boosting Intra-Africa Action Plan, Boosting Intra-Africa Trade Action Plan. And at the heart of the action plan is how do we improve the very dismal state of intra-Africa trade. At that time, it was at around 11%. It is now at, the best figure I've seen is that it is intra-Africa trade is now at 18%, which is still significantly low compared to intra-EU trade, which is at 70%, intra-North America trade, which is at 49%, intra-Asia trade, which is at above 35%. And so the challenge for ourselves that we put to ourselves in Accra, Ghana in 2012, when we adopted the Boosting Intra-Africa Trade Action Plan, was to significantly boost intra-Africa trade, to place Africa on a path for industrial development, place Africa on a path for production of value-added goods, and most importantly, to ensure that we have a degree of specialization as we trade amongst ourselves as Africans, so that we do a number of things. One, we no longer trade apples for apples, that we don't trade apples between Ethiopia, where I am, and apples with neighboring countries. And the same applies for other regions. So that is really the first objective, boosting intra-Africa trade. And then second, at the heart also of that action plan is ensuring that we rely less on the export of primary commodities to developed markets, and ensuring that we reconfigure and we relook at Africa's structural foundation. And so this is really what led to where we are today, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area. And so the objective of boosting intra-Africa trade, leveraging on regional supply chains, is very, very important. And you've got to have industrial development for that. You mentioned infrastructure. If we don't make a very clear linkage between trade and infrastructure, this project that we have just embarked on is not going to be very, very successful. We know that in Africa, the deficit, the infrastructure deficit, is over $100 billion. I have a very good friend, Hubert Danso, who says it's actually a deficit, but it's an opportunity. And Hubert is right. It is the $100 billion infrastructure deficit is an opportunity for Africa to have greater investments, enhanced investments in infrastructure, in roads, all of the things that facilitate our trade. So I am very, very determined that we as Africans, and if there's anything this crisis has underscored, is that we as Africans, this is the last opportunity that we have to place Africa on a path for industrial development, large-scale job creation, so that young Africans, so that we stop burying young Africans on the oceans of the Mediterranean. We create jobs for young Africans up and down this continent. We establish value chains so that all countries can benefit from this agreement. So it is a step. It is a step that I'm very, very grateful to be at the forefront of the leadership of this organization, but it is a step in the right direction. And when you look at the Abuja Treaty, this is what was envisaged in the Abuja Treaty and the Lagos Plan of Action, that Africa will start a process of market integration. And so this is what we are beginning to embark on.
Okay, great. So I'm going to get into a little bit more details concretely about exactly how you intend to do this. But one question on everybody's mind is, where are we today, right? Given what's happening in the world, pandemic, and we all know that there was a date that had been set that we were supposed to be looking forward to trading as of July 2020. What's the status right now? Where are we, and what should we be looking forward to in terms of timeline?
Well, we had been directed by heads of states that by the 1st of July 2020, we will start trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area, at least for those countries who have ratified the agreement, which today stands at 28 countries. So 28 countries have accepted the legal obligations. We call them state parties. And there are 54 countries out of 55 who have signed the agreement, who have signaled an intention to be bound by the legal obligations. And as part of that process, as I say, we were directed on the 1st of July is when we start trading. Of course, COVID-19 happened. We now have a situation where in Africa, 42 countries in Africa are either under a full lockdown with border closures or a partial lockdown with border closures. And second, countries and governments are focusing on saving lives, which in my view, quite sensibly and quite responsibly, we have to focus on saving lives. And so we've had to take account of this, and we've had to recommend to the heads of states to say to them, consider where we are, as a continent, the border closures, all the factors that militate against us being able to trade under the AfCFTA as we had intended. Take these into account and think about whether or not we still stick to the date of the 1st of July. So we are waiting for the heads of states to tell us what they will decide. Let me just say this, that there is, of course, a very, very strong effort on our part as the Secretariat, working with the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the Department of Trade and Industry of the African Union to ensure that even though the borders are closed, that the essential goods are still able to transit through the borders so that they reach the millions and millions of Africans who need the essential goods. So that is where we are. We are waiting for heads of states to tell us whether or not we will be able to trade as was directed on the 1st of July. But I think we must not we must be mindful of the significance of this pandemic, and as I said earlier, we really have to give governments the space to fight the pandemic with all the tools that are available at each and every African government's disposal, including in this case, including ministers of trade who are engaged in finding solutions to how do we save small, medium enterprises in our country? How do we make sure that businesses survive through the lockdown in our country? For me, this is the priority for each and every government in Africa, and quite sensibly and quite responsibly. So we will get back to our work, and we will redouble our efforts at the right time.
Great. Okay, so kind of now back into the details, right? So how a lot of people who are critics of the agreement will say, sure, it's great that we want to start trading, but if there's nothing to trade, because there's very little production in these African countries, then it's not going to change anything, right? So what's the Secretariat's plan, or how are you thinking about actually encouraging production?
Well, we have, I said this during my swearing-in ceremony after the election. If this agreement benefits only countries that already have a relative industrial base, a manufacturing capacity, and export capacity, it shall fail. It's not going to succeed. So we have to find ways of ensuring that the agreement benefits countries like Kenya, Morocco, Egypt, South Africa, equally as much as it benefits smaller countries that today don't have the industrial base and the manufacturing capacity. So that means that we have to actively work to build regional value chains, to establish regional value chains that all countries can actually be part of. Let me give you an example. In the area of automobiles, if you look at the automobiles value chain in Southern Africa, you have South Africa that is engaged in manufacturing and assembly of vehicles. You've got countries that are neighboring South Africa who do not have an automobile strategy, who do not have an automobile sector, but those countries are actually engaged in the value chain. They provide leather seats, they provide catalytic converters. So it is possible. It is possible to establish a value chain across a particular region on any given sector, whether it is automobiles, agro-processing, on any given sector. What we have to do is to collectively identify between the private sector, between the public sector, that is trade policymakers, industrial policymakers, civil society. We have to identify those value chains so that each and every country in Africa that is part of this agreement does benefit. And I've just given an example of how you can do that. Remember, in the early 50s, Singapore was a fishing village. And Singapore, over many, many years, disciplined implementation of an industrial development strategy over many years, of course, was able to develop and was able to diversify into largely a services economy. So what I'm saying is not revolutionary. It's been done before. What we do require is an action plan for implementation of an industrial development strategy, as I say, that will be applied and implemented up and down the African continent in a very, very determined and a disciplined way over a number of years. So I think this is really, really, for me, the important factor as we implement this agreement.
Okay, another major bottleneck or stumbling block to trade is the proliferation of various rules, certifications. You know, every country has different guidelines, lots of discretion amongst border control officers. How will the Secretariat, even if say that there are guidelines published somewhere, what we often find is that it's enforcement that is a problem, right? When you actually get to the border, they tell you all sorts of stories. You know, what will the enforcement capacity be, right, to ensure that whatever is agreed on as a standard procedure is actually being implemented by each country?
Yeah. Well, customs procedures is in all circumstances, and whether you are talking in the WTO or in NAFTA, or customs procedures is always the most challenging part of a trade agreement. It is even more challenging when you have big countries with many borders. Some borders are remote, far from the capital, and so on. So enforcement is a big problem, a big challenge, always has been in a number of ways. Fraudulent invoicing. You have transshipment of goods that come into the border under a preference, which these goods should not be enjoying this preference. So this is a problem as a general rule when it comes to trade agreements. So what we have to do, we have to work as a secretariat with individual countries, with regional economic communities such as ECOWAS, such as SADC, such as EAC, to ensure that we improve the capacity of customs officials so that the customs authorities, they know what preferences, what rules to implement in relation to the AfCFTA, so that they know that there is a difference between an AfCFTA product and a product coming from Mercosur or NAFTA or any other trade arrangement. It really comes down to enforcement of customs authorities and customs procedures.
And
if we don't, sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead, finish up, and then I'll ask my question.
I was just going to say this. We know from empirical evidence that transshipment of goods, third country goods, is a huge problem that leads to job losses. And we don't want this agreement to lead to job losses. We want this agreement to create jobs. And so we've got to make sure that we work very, very hard to improve the capacity of our customs authorities. I will say this, though, that it is like any other form of crime. You will never be able to eliminate customs fraud or entry of third party goods into the AfCFTA market, just like you can never ever be able to eliminate crime. But what you have to do is to make it incredibly difficult for transshipment to happen, for fraudulent invoicing to happen, and that you have to work very, very closely with the customs authorities in individual countries. It's going to take time, it's going to be very, very difficult, and it may take even more than 10 years to be able to get to the point where we say we really have mitigated that particular risk.
So it sounds like you're saying the Secretariat is going to be doing a lot of training with various customs officials to ensure that they first understand what the rules are. Now, what's the enforcement mechanism? So say there is, a particular country's customs officials that is systematically flouting the rules, right? Or systematically not applying whatever has been agreed upon as a standard procedure. What remedies do the other countries have?
Well, if you are a state party, you have legal rights. You have you enjoy a certain level of treatment. You are entitled to a certain level of treatment from other state parties. So if a state party, on the face of it, prima facie, is allowing or enabling the transshipment of goods, you as a country, as a complainant, you have a right to initiate action under the protocol on dispute settlement. And the outcome of that process of dispute settlement will be a particular ruling that you, as a country that is alleged to be encouraging or allowing this behavior, you will be required to bring your measures in conformity with their agreement. And if you don't do so, of course, the country that alleges injury will be able to retaliate based on the rules. So all of these things, we have built them into the rules into whether it's customs procedures, whether it's trade remedies, but we have built into the rules, into the agreement itself, what happens when a particular country either refuses to apply and implement its obligations, or is unaware, for example, that this type of activity is happening. That country will be given some time to bring its measures into conformity, or to remedy the conduct that is alleged to be causing injury to a country that should be enjoying the obligations under the agreement. So there is recourse, there is legal recourse for countries that do not implement and apply the rules as they have been agreed under the agreement.
Okay, so just one more question to close the loop on this. So it sounds like, so yes, so there might be, if there is, it sounds like what you're describing is basically a court dispute resolution system, much like what the WTO has, where a country can go and complain, and then maybe the remedy is they say, okay, well, you're allowed to slap, tariffs on this country for being flouting the rules, right? Now, to play devil's advocate on that, right? That kind of rule-based system only works when you have incentives already existing to play by the rules. So here's what I mean. For example, right? If it's currently the case that a certain country has nothing to lose from flouting the rules, because in fact they are benefiting more from flouting the rules. So for example, right, Nigeria's current dispute with Benin, Nigeria alleges that Benin is systematically flouting the rules, and most people would say, well, Benin has built an economy based on receiving revenue from certain items that is shipped to it, that it then transships into Nigeria. It's not in Benin's financial interest to, stop these activities, because it's going to lose revenue, right? And, so this is where the politics comes into play. So how then do you make it in Benin's interest to play by the rules in the first place, to make the whole system actually work and viable? And, this is an example, but yeah.
We looked at dispute settlement mechanisms from around the world, whether they are dispute settlement mechanisms for investment, commercial disputes, trade disputes, a range of economic activity dispute settlement that we looked at, and as I say, including the WTO, and we improved on that. Now, countries enter into trade agreements as an act of sovereignty. Nobody forces you as a country to enter into this agreement. So we expect that in the exercise of your sovereignty as a country, that you will abide by the rules. And part of abiding by the rules is that where there's an appellate body decision that goes against you, there's a particular finding against you, an adverse finding against you, part of the rules and part of exercising your sovereignty as a country is that you must abide by the appellate body decision or the outcome or the ruling. So as a matter of public international law, we expect that countries that have ratified the agreement, that they will abide by the rules. If you look at the countries that have ratified the agreement, and you look at some of the reasons why countries ratify the agreement, the reasons that they have advanced, they say that we want to create a positive investor climate in our country. We want to establish a trade and investment rule-based system for regulating trade and investment in our country and in the region, of course. And we want to overcome, the smallness of our economies. We want to enhance our economies of scale. We want to overcome market fragmentation. We want our region to be very, very attractive to investors. So if you as a particular country, if there is a ruling or a finding against you, an adverse finding against you as country X, and you do not bring your measures in conformity with the agreement, this is really inconsistent with your objective. It defeats your objective of being an investor-friendly climate. And I'm not talking about FDI, I'm talking about intra-Africa investment. I'm talking about domestic investment, even within the country itself. So I think for me, this is really a significant factor that countries will take into account as they decide whether or not to implement and to apply a ruling of the appellate body, which is an adverse ruling to them. I do believe that that this issue of creating a positive investor climate for trade, investment, creating an environment where there is an assessment on ease of doing business, that you actually, as a country, you feature quite highly on the index of doing business. This is for me an incentive.
Can I just ask everybody to mute their lines, please? Can you please mute your line? Okay. Please go ahead. Oh, God. No, please go ahead, Mr. Minnie. Oh, it sounds like there's a problem.
You could put your question in. Please type your question in.
Oh, did we lose my volume? Okay, can you please continue? But you have to unmute.
Yes, I was continuing. Thank you very much. So this issue of going back to I think I've addressed the question around conformity with the rules and what happens if you don't conform to the rules. But let me also address the other underlying question, the other underlying part of your question, and that is transshipment of goods. Why countries, or why certain countries are engaged in the transshipment of goods. In this agreement, we have made it categorically clear that we are not going to accept a shirt coming in, country X puts buttons on the shirt and then they say it's an AfCFTA product. So the threshold, the rules of origin, the value addition requirements are very, very high, very, very stringent, which is where the issue of customs authorities comes in, because they have to make sure that we apply those rules. So countries, and the reason we have said collectively, all of us, that the value addition must be high. You must not be allowed to put a button on a shirt and say it comes from an AfCFTA country. value addition is directly linked to industrial development. So we want to prevent transshipment, not only for job losses, but also to foster industrial development in the AfCFTA, in Africa. So we've got to make sure that as we think about this issue and as we debate this issue of transshipment, that we link it to industrial development. So it is not in your interest as country X or country Y to be engaged in transshipment in the long term. In the long term, what is in your interests is to make sure that you have an industrial development strategy that you apply, and that you actually create jobs, sustainable jobs for your own people, and you establish a value chain not only in your country but in the region. So it is in each and every country's interest to make sure that we prevent transshipment, not only from a legal point of view, but from an industrial development point of view.
Okay, great. So it sounds a little bit also like you're saying that the Secretariat will be employing a bit of sort of public shaming. You know, if you've gotten an adverse judgment against you and you were not enforcing it, that's, you know, potentially a basis for other investors not to want to come to your country. You know, so a bit of a peer pressure type of system to help force people to comply. So my last question for you before we open it up, we do have a lot of questions I see coming in, is how should we judge you, right? How should we judge you? And, you know, knowing now that when a bit of a pause, so we're not necessarily starting official quote unquote trading in July. So let's just assume, so we don't know when it'll be, but how should we judge you both in the medium term, say 2 years or 1 year after we actually start trading, and then in a more medium, longer term, in 5 years?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of things that that I think it's important that we achieve. First, the institution itself. So institutional establishment, the Secretariat itself, it has to be credible. It has to be staffed by the best and the brightest Africans. It has to be a non-political secretariat. And we've got to make sure that as a body that will monitor implementation of the agreement, that we are actually world-class. And so for me, this is the number one objective if we're going in the long term. I negotiated many years at the WTO, one of the best institutions, multilateral institutions in the world. I think we can be better than the WTO in how we implement this agreement, and in establishing the institution itself. I honestly believe that we can be much better than even the best international practice. Second, I think what is very important is how we establish the credibility and the integrity of our dispute settlement mechanism. Our companies, African companies, must have comfort in the sense that if there is a dispute that arises pursuant to the agreement, that dispute will be adjudicated in a fair manner, in an impartial manner, in a transparent manner, and in a non-political manner. And so I think the dispute settlement mechanism that we have established is really important for enhancing investor confidence. And by investor confidence, I'm talking about African investor confidence. By establishing a dispute settlement mechanism that will make sure that African investor confidence in the dispute settlement mechanism itself is absolutely guaranteed. I think third, if we can, going back to the point I made earlier, if we can establish value chains in 2 or 3 areas, and here I don't want to preempt what the member states will say, But if we, for example, if we focus on agro-processing, automobile, and so on labor-intensive regional value chains that will actually have a direct impact on creating jobs across the African continent, in big countries and small countries, in relatively industrialized countries and relatively non-industrialized countries. If we establish 2 or 3 value chains, I think that will be a very, very good start. And last, if we can have young Africans in trade, women in trade, as part of implementation of this agreement, I think for me personally, that will be a significant achievement, because we know when you look at trade agreements from around the world, we know why there are right-wing chauvinist governments in many parts of the world, because these right-wing chauvinist governments leveraged on the dissatisfaction with globalization, and of course, on the dissatisfaction with the manner in which trade agreements have been implemented, which has left behind significant segments of our society. So for me, if we can have young Africans in trade, women in trade, and we have this as part of our implementation, that will be a significant achievement, in my opinion.
Excellent. You've touched on a lot of other questions I have, but I don't want to take up all the time. So I think that we have a couple questions. Joseph, did you want to say something before we go into taking some of the questions that are already on the floor?
Okay. Hi. Thank you, Amaka. I want to especially recognize some ambassadors here, some ambassadors and former ambassadors on the floor, and also thank you for joining in. And I also want to recognize the president of American Chamber of Commerce, Ghana. Thank you for dialing in. A quick one. I want Paul Lely to share his question. He has a question he would like to ask, and I think it's quite important in this COVID hard times. Yeah. So Paul Lely Jr., please, can you ask your question?
Good afternoon, His Excellency. I wanted to ask, my first question is, what role does the AfCFTA play in the fight against counterfeits and parallel trade, as there are a number of cases on fake products and equipment during this pandemic?
Okay. Okay, shall we, how do you want to do it? Shall we take a round of questions? Maybe 3 questions at a time?
Yes, that's a good idea. So we don't want to give everybody the floor to talk. So here, let me just throw a couple other questions that we've seen, just in for the sake of efficiency, right? So we've had a couple questions already about e-commerce, right? And specifically about the evolution of the e-commerce protocol. What will the protocol be for e-commerce, and what kind of practices will the AfCFTA follow with regard to DST? And then I'll just add one more question. You know, I see some of the questions here have already been addressed. So why don't you just take those 2 first, and then I will line up a few others for you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Well, first, I think counterfeit goods falls into the category of typically goods that are transshipped. For the most part, are goods that are counterfeit or substandard. And so we have in the agreement, we have rules that prevent the trading in substandard goods or goods that are counterfeit. And again, it goes back to the challenge of customs procedures and the ability to enforce customs procedures. So I think it is, if you take, for example, medicines, the issue of substandard medications is really a problem in Africa, across regions. And so we've got to work with customs authorities. Again, I want to stress that we have to work with customs authorities to make sure that we prevent the proliferation of counterfeit goods, parallel goods, substandard goods. The rules are there. What will remain a challenge, and I am the first one to confess that this is going to be one of the biggest problems that we're going to be faced with. On e-commerce and digitization, the Assembly of States have the Assembly of Heads of States, the presidents, the leaders have directed that we negotiate a protocol rules for regulating e-commerce in Africa. And here I think we have an opportunity as Africa. First, we need to look at not just e-commerce, but we've got to look at beyond e-commerce. We've got to look at the digitization of trade in general. We've got to look at how do we establish rules that will make sure that digitization is an integral part of implementation of this agreement. I will give you a number of examples. We know that in Lagos, we know that in Kigali, we know that there are young Africans who are actually, trailblazing in terms of innovation for digital-enabled e-commerce. We know that there are young Africans who are brilliant software engineers who are actually enabling the digitization of trade in Africa. And so the challenge and the question, I think, is how do we make sure that as we implement this agreement, we have we leverage on this innovation that we know happens in Africa. Second, I think in general, as we implement the agreement, there are certain things that we can do. There are digitization platforms that we can introduce that will facilitate efficient trade in Africa. For example, customs procedures. It is possible to digitize customs procedures. If you look at what we do now at the moment across all countries, and that is manual, we do verification of what we call certificates of origin. We do it manually. It is possible to digitize that and make our trade more efficient. It is possible, third, it is possible when you look at examples that things that are happening today, where if you go to Uganda, you will find fish farmers in Uganda that are actually using digital platforms to access markets across the border. So I think it is an incredibly important part of our implementation strategy, and that is how do we digitize trade in Africa. It's linked to the fourth industrial revolution. So we've got to think very, very creatively about what are the disruptors of trade and investment in a digital sense, as we've known it in the past. And here I hear everybody saying that Africa has an opportunity to leapfrog into the fourth industrial revolution on the back of digital trade, digitization, e-commerce. And so I think it's an incredibly important platform that we have to make sure is an integral part of our implementation.
Excellent. Okay, so I have a couple more questions for you, and then we'll take the next round. So several people have asked about the plans for digital payment systems, right? And some of us on this webinar will have heard about the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System that AfCFTA was involved with. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about what plans you might have around, some of these payments and financial processing system and how it would facilitate inter-Africa trade, and what the status is of the ones that exist, like the Pan-African and Pan-African Payment and Settlement System? That's the first question. Second question is, and again, this has come up a lot, is that we have a lot of private companies on this call who are trying to think about how concretely it can tap into the work that the Secretariat is doing, right? I think what a lot of people may not understand, but you've explained today, is that it's really a state dispute resolution system. So it's going to be countries that are going to be able to file disputes, right, on behalf of the companies. So, but for the companies that are looking to engage in one way or the other with the Secretariat in the implementation, what's your advice to them?
Okay, so the digital payments platform, we are working very, very closely with AfCFTA, as you mentioned. As a matter of fact, yesterday I had a call with the CEO and president of AfCFTA. We were briefing one another on progress in terms of the payments, the Pan-African Payments and Settlement Platform. AfCFTA has offered to provide resources, financial resources, for first establishment of the platform for payments and settlement. And second, they have provided a substantial amount of money for settlement of payments between and across borders in Africa, where there is trading that takes place under the AfCFTA. And so this is a significant booster to the AfCFTA, because you will now be in Kenya, you will now be able to make a payment in Kenyan shillings, and somebody in Nigeria will be able to receive the funds in Nigerian naira. There will be no extraterritorial settlement partner involved. Everything will be done in Africa by Africans. The platform is being provided by AfCFTA, which is owned, as we all know, by African governments. And so I think from the point of view of trade finance and giving meaning to trade finance in Africa, what AfCFTA has done by partnering with the AfCFTA is to really give meaning to trade in Africa and payments and settlement systems in Africa. And of course, all of this will be very cost effective, and it will be freely available across African countries that have ratified the agreement. And so we are very, very excited about this project that we're working on with AfCFTA. We are hoping that in the near future, I shouldn't put a time frame to it, but in the near future, that we will be able to, there will be a rollout of this Pan-African Payments and Settlement Platform that is being resourced financially, but also in terms of the platform itself, the technical capacity that is being provided by AfCFTA. In the last question about private sector collaboration, and also I think a part of it was on dispute settlement. Where you have a dispute as a company, you will not be able to initiate your claim directly with either the government or your counterparty private sector whom you allege has caused injury to you. You will not be able to do that. What you will be able to do is that your claim will be espoused by your government. So in other words, you would have to approach your government, your Ministry of Trade, Investment, and so on, and inform your Ministry of Trade and Investment that you have, on the face of it, you have a claim against a particular party in a foreign jurisdiction, which is AfCFTA, and you want to pursue this claim, and it is then your government that will espouse that particular claim. Now, this is the case in the WTO. Of course, it's not the case with bilateral investment treaties where we have investor-state dispute settlement, but in this case, we have it is state-to-state arbitration. And as I said earlier, there is a legal process that you can pursue to the very end to assert your rights. And you have now rights that are circumscribed in the agreement under African trade law, the AfCFTA, but you will also have rights. If you wish to pursue your claim, you will talk to your legal counsel, and you may want to consider, if you want to enforce a particular ruling, you may want to consider the New York Convention on enforcement of awards. There's a range of tools that are available at your disposal as a private sector who claims injury on a particular matter of law. But in respect of the AfCFTA itself, you have a right to appear before a panel, dispute settlement panel, an appellate body panel where you take the issues at law in review, and then there is, of course, a ruling that is issued. And so, in my view, this is going to be the platform for resolving commercial, trade, intellectual property rights, and competition disputes in Africa as we go forward. The private sector is very important. We didn't negotiate this agreement for ourselves as trade negotiators. This agreement is to facilitate trade, investment, commerce in Africa. And so it's very, very important that we bring along with us, as we implement the agreement, the views of the private sector. Already we have hosted, the African Union has hosted 2 AfCFTA business forums, and they are interactive, engaging platforms. We had the last one in Niamey, Niger. We always have them on the margins of the summit. And so there is an opportunity for interaction with heads of states, for ministers. And the business forum is really business people that are exchanging views about how this agreement can improve business, commerce, and investment in Africa. Second, what I intend to do is to establish which will meet more regularly, an industrial development forum, which, as I said earlier, will comprise private sector, trade policy officials, industrial policy officials, so that what we do when we say that we're implementing value chains in Africa, that it actually is something that is informed by the needs of business across the African continent, so that it is not something that that we as trade officials that comes out of our heads. It has to be informed by the private sector, and of course, over and above that, I am always willing to engage and meet with the private sector. My door is open to meet with the private sector at any time.
So actually, that's a perfect place to segue into the next question, which just builds on what you said. Basically, people just want a little bit more guidance on exactly how the input of the private sector will be incorporated into some of the standardization that is happening now, right? So for example, one of the questions said, that they usually clear procedures for WTO engagement processes, right? So right now we know that there is work happening to come up with harmonization rules for certain certification processes and so on and so forth. Is there a process to get private sector input into those rules that are being developed now?
Well, I'm assuming the question is about rules of origin.
Yes, no, but not only. Say, we're talking about the harmonization of all kinds of trade rules, right?
Okay.
Like certification rules, quality guidance, just all sorts of things.
Well, we already have. We have in the agreement, we have subsidiary instruments that that actually specifically address that question. We have the annex on technical barriers to trade. We have the annex on sanitary and phytosanitary standards. We have the annex, the subsidiary instrument on non-tariff barriers. And then we also have a mechanism for resolving these, what we call NTBs, these non-technical barriers to trade. So if you, for example, come up with a rule or a technical requirement for, let's say, this water bottle, and you will see their technical requirements at the back of the water bottle. If your technical requirements are overly or excessively burdensome to meet the objective of protecting public health, that particular technical barrier to trade will be struck down. So there is already, and this is based in the WTO and other trade agreements, there are already set standards and rules that we have agreed to for how countries should generate, whether it's public health standards or whether it's standards to protect consumers. There are already in the annex in the agreement, we already have those standards, and they are done. It is the same thing as is done in at the level of the WTO. Then there is a branch of that, of course, related, and that is rules of origin. And the rules of origin are a little bit different, but they relate to industrial development, of course, as I said earlier. And these are, this is where there is private sector engagement, because if you have to know what your industry, what the capacity of your industry is to produce a shirt or whatever the case may be. So the answer is yes. There are rules, there are guidelines that we have already agreed to.
Great. So this question, and I'm going to ask now, keeps coming up in all sorts of different ways. So I'm going to try to ask it in a broad enough way to encompass it, which is just, when we started this conversation, we talked a little bit about, well, how are we going to actually encourage production to make sure that they're goods to trade, right? Can you just talk a little bit more about, like, maybe examples about the kinds of programs that you're going to be running to help develop those value chains that you talked about?
Well, I mentioned the example of automobiles. Let me mention a different example to underscore the point. Take agro-processing. Agro-processing it fits into so many different areas of a country's economy. Agro-processing feeds into automobiles. It feeds into the production of leather goods, leather shoes, and so on. So what we have to do in a practical sense is to identify certain areas across the board. And it's going to be difficult. It's not going to be easy. We've got to identify certain common areas across the state parties of the AfCFTA. If we say leather, the country I'm in at the moment, Ethiopia, is a producer of leather. But so is South Africa and a few other countries, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana. But when you look at the global value chain on leather goods, the minute you start processing the leather, it attracts very, very high duties, up to 1,000%. So this discourages manufacturing processing in Africa, because nobody is going to engage in manufacturing if you are exporting if you have duties of over 1,000% or close to 1,000% for a manufactured product. Take cotton is another example that I can mention. The cotton 4 countries, Benin, Mali, and so on. The global trading system discourages these countries from processing the cotton into finished products. So we are stuck as exporters and producers of primary products because we have not been able to sufficiently create the manufacturing capacity and the market in our own countries. So now what we've done is that we've established a market of 1.3 billion people. We are now having to reconfigure the value chain so that we supply to ourselves as Africans, and we supply to one another as Africans. So the leather producer in Ethiopia, we should be able to have productive investment in manufacturing, in equipment, so that, and here we can do so by establishing a fund for productive investment in manufacturing, so that if you are in Ethiopia and you are a leather producer, you now have the capacity to have investment in your manufacturing capacity, in your manufacturing, so that you stop producing just the leather and exporting it, that you process it, you produce it, you process it, you export it within the African market. And this is, for me, this is the example of a value chain. You may even, let me just finish the point. You may even, because I'm making an example of Ethiopia because of where I am, they are establishing an auto sector. So you are a leather producer in Awasa. You can actually be part of the value chain for automobiles, for leather seats in the car. So we really, I think for me, these are the practical examples of what we have to do in a Pan-African way, not in a regional or country way, but in a Pan-African way, so that we become an attractive investor destination, a destination for investors.
So just to close the loop on this, I just want to make sure the role of the Secretariat is clear in that. So are you saying that you're going to be running a fund that will facilitate investments into certain kinds of production that has been agreed upon as priority areas?
The agreement requires, Article 3 of their agreement requires that the Secretariat and the Secretary General should take measures to establish regional value chains in Africa and should take active steps to enhance industrial development in Africa. That is my responsibility. I obviously don't have the money to do that. However, we can mobilize private sector, and I will come to you and say, can you facilitate a dialogue with investors so that we establish a fund? We establish a fund for investment in value chains in the areas that will be identified by the countries themselves. So our role is to facilitate and to ensure that the investor comes to the table, the country comes to the table. We go to the cotton 4 producing countries and we say that this investor has put on the table $50 million for productive capacity manufacturing in cotton, in Benin, in Togo, in Mali, in the cotton producing countries, and so on. So that's our role. That is how we have to facilitate that process.
So a bit
and that's
of
where the fund comes in.
Yeah, so almost a bit of a Pan-African sort of centralized coordination of value chain development across, that's, that role. Okay, great. Yeah. So we also know there's been the, I think it's the AfriExim Bank also set aside a $3 billion adjustment facility, right? And earlier we talked about the politics involved in making sure that, in every trade agreement, there are winners and losers. And you want to make sure you're bringing the losers along. Can you just maybe talk a little bit about how that that fund is envisioned to be used, right? Like, will it be used for some of the investments that you're talking about, or will there be a system like we have in the EU where certain countries are financially compensated for revenue losses that might happen, like the Benin example, for example, right? Is there room for, compensating Benin for some of the revenue losses for complying with the rules, right? That then allows trade to blossom.
Yeah, well, as you said, there are winners and losers, and there will be immediate winners, and those are the countries that already have the industrial development capacity. In some countries there's empirical evidence on this. Some countries will experience short to medium term revenue losses as a result of liberalizing their trade, reducing tariffs, and allowing imports into their markets. There is revenue forgone in terms of the tariffs. And so what AfCFTA has offered is an adjustment facility, where at the moment I think it stands at around $1 billion. And the adjustment facility will assist those countries who are state parties to the agreement. You have to be a state party, who are state parties to the agreement, to the extent that they experience revenue losses in the implementation of the agreement. And this could be a sector, this could be by sector. For example, it could be in the area of textiles and clothing. It could be any particular area of your economy that is covered by the agreement. So the facility is to assist countries, is aimed at assisting countries to make that adjustment and to make that transition, and to cushion the loss from revenue forgone from duties, from tariffs. We are still negotiating the modalities. What I've just described is the principle itself, but the modalities are still being negotiated. So it's going to be part of implementation.
Great. So back to the question about how we judge you, right? So I think basically you've said, and I think it's very clear, in the short term, you should be judged on actually setting up the institution, creating a credible institution, maybe even raising awareness about some of the issues, doing, coordination. But what about in the long term, right? Maybe you give us a sense of what you consider as a reasonable timeline to actually see intra-Africa trade improve concretely, right?
Well,
what's the yeah, go ahead.
The aspirational goal of the African Union is that by the year 2030, intra-Africa trade must be over 50%. By the year 2030. And so to get to that point, you've got to ensure that the building blocks are there, that the foundation is there, as I was saying earlier, that you have established value chains, that goods can transit through the borders efficiently and in accordance with the agreement. And you've got to make sure that the services sector is vibrant and contributes to the combined GDP of Africa. And so I think if we can get in the long term, of course I will not be around anymore, but if we by 2030, intra-Africa trade is at 50% and above, I think we will have established a very, very good foundation.
What do you think will be the most difficult obstacle or issue or reality for you to tackle as the as the first Secretary General of this secretariat that doesn't even exist yet, in a place where people are not that used to border security or border sanctity? What in your view will be what's your most difficult challenge? What keeps you up at night as you think about implementing this agreement and making it successful?
The most difficult challenge is going to be implementation and adhering to the rules. For example, at the moment, trade protectionism has increased because countries, I'm not talking in Africa, I mean, according to the WTO, countries have put in place export restrictions on personal protection equipment, on all the equipment that is required to fight the pandemic. We are seeing an increase in non-compliance with multilateral trade rules during this crisis. So what I worry about is the inability or at times the willful lack of compliance with the rules, because it's not always willful. Sometimes conditions are difficult. But in general, the worry I have is implementation and compliance with the rules. That's as a general matter. But I must also say that what I have seen in the closed sessions of the heads of states is a political will to implement and abide by the rules. And so, although international experience points to the fact that sometimes countries will not be in adherence to the rules, on the other hand, I have seen with my own eyes, from my own experience, sitting in the closed sessions of heads of states, I have seen political will to make sure that we implement the rules. Where the bigger challenge will be is, as you mentioned, the border official in a remote part of the country, and whether or not he or she adheres to the rules that require him or her to apply AfCFTA customs procedures. So this is the number one concern for me. And I know that there are a lot of cynics who said that when we were negotiating, they said Africa shall never be able to conclude the negotiations. We concluded in 4.5 years, much quicker than what is happening in the WTO. Doha round 20 years later is still being negotiated. We negotiated in 4.5 years. When we concluded phase 1, they said, well, it will never be signed. The agreement was signed by 54 out of 55 countries. We proved the cynics wrong. Then they said it will never enter into force. Africans will never do it. They don't have a history of following through on their own agreements. 28 countries have now ratified the agreement. It has entered into force. And there are more countries that are signaling that they will ratify and deposit their instruments of ratification. We proved the cynics wrong. So at every point, the cynics said we can't do it, we've done it. And so I believe we are going to do it. I believe we will implement the agreement. I believe that there are some countries who have the political commitment to implement the agreement. They may not be able to do so today, but they are going to do it. They will implement it because they recognize the importance of this agreement.
Excellent. I think we're almost at time. So let's see, let me just see if there's any other questions that I haven't talked about. All right, so a lot of the questions that are coming in now, we've already addressed. They're asking about ecosystem. So why don't we just end on a word from you? So, we talked about what's the hardest, what you're most worried about in, let's say, in I guess, what are you most optimistic about as you embark on this process?
Well, I believe that even with the challenge of COVID-19, which I see as a crisis, but there's an opportunity in this crisis, and that is that most developed countries have introduced economic relief packages to re-inject dynamism and growth in their own economies. The US has introduced over $1 trillion stimulus package. The European Union has introduced, I think it's a little over half, $500 billion. It may be now it may be coming close to $1 trillion. The US has provided a package to the airline industry of $60 billion in the form of grants and loans. African countries, many African countries do not have that monetary policy space, nor do they have that the fiscal policy space to provide such substantial economic relief packages. So that means that for us as Africans and as Africa, implementation of the AfCFTA is our stimulus package. It is our economic relief package, because if we are able, and by the estimates of the World Bank, Africa's economies will contract by up to 5%, between 2 and 5%. If we are able to significantly boost intra-Africa trade, if we are able to significantly boost intra-Africa investment and re-inject dynamism and ensure that the AfCFTA is actually the driver of economic growth in Africa, I think that is a critical a tool that we have at our disposal. As I say, there are very few countries in Africa that can put on the table the substantial amounts of stimulus packages that we have seen. So this AfCFTA is Africa's economic recovery strategy. It is Africa's economic recovery plan.
So I actually have, since you mentioned the COVID-19, let me end on this one question, which is, I've seen discussions about African countries coming together to pool resources to acquire, to procure reagents and some of the things that are needed for, testing. And then, of course, there's been discussion of like, will Africa be able to get a vaccine? Because there was going to be all sorts of costs and race about who can get the vaccine. Will the AfCFTA play a role in, sort of in these kinds of procurement sort of pooling or discussions, or are you playing a role? I don't know.
Our mandate doesn't extend that far. The African Union Bureau of Assembly of Heads of States, in other words, the heads of states, they are coordinating a pan-African response to COVID-19. The heads of states have established a COVID-19 Solidarity Fund, which has raised funds, about $4 million for the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Second, the African Union, the Assembly, the heads of states are coordinating a pan-African COVID-19 pandemic fighting strategy. So in terms of the procurement of what is required to fight the pandemic is not being done by us. It is done elsewhere within the African Union.
Okay.
Our role has been to advise on the trade implications.
Okay. Well, with that, I'm going to say thank you so very much. We've gotten lots of questions about how private companies can be involved, how they can bring their strengths to bear. I think you've answered that question, and so I don't want to keep asking you. I think that the answer to that is, His Excellency is open to meeting with any the various stakeholders, and and there's lots of ways for people to be involved in the the domestic rule setting processes within their own countries, right? So we'll leave that there. And I'm going to call on Margaret Olele, who is the CEO and Executive Secretary of the American Business Council in Nigeria, to close us off.
Hi, thanks, Amaka, and thank you so much for excellently anchoring this. We would like to thank His Excellency for making our time to attend this. It was a lot of people said it's not easy to get him to attend events or even be at events like this. For me, I think one of our take home is the fact that AfCFTA is our economic recovery plan, is our economic stimulus in Africa, and we are looking forward to the private sector partnering, with AfCFTA to progress this dialogue even a lot further. On this note, I'd also like to thank our other stakeholders, partners, the American Chamber of Commerce, Ghana, the other AmChams, across Africa, and also the US African Business Council. We have our media partners. Thank you so much for these, as well as the partners, Jumia, Google, and Procter & Gamble. So on this note, I'll say thank you everyone for being here, and this is just the beginning of the dialogue. I believe that we're going to take this further. Thank you all.
Thank you again to everybody. And thank you so much to Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. And we will have a private sector dialogue and a private sector platform. I just have to get to Accra first, and then we will get going on that. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. All right.